Hey everyone, welcome to my garage shop. Today I'm going to be working on this growth board which we're building for our granddaughter who we're expecting in a few weeks. Now when we built one for my daughter many years ago, it was just a basic board with a painted number line and some stickers and that sort of thing. When we talked about doing one for our granddaughter, our daughter and son-in-law expressed some interest in a live edge walnut type board like you see a lot of people doing with tabletops these days, and with a epoxy inlay for the number line. So that's what I'm going to be working on. I hope you follow along. It should be lots of fun.
Here I'm establishing a center line since this board has no straight edges, and then drawing a line perpendicular to that so I can cut the board square at the ends. I bought this slab at the Tecton Timber Company in College Station. They have an incredible selection. If you're ever in Central Texas, they're worth checking out. Here I'm cutting the board to length since it's much longer than we needed, and as you can see it's taxing the limits of my cutoff saw. I'm using the cutoff as a test piece for all the various operations that I need to do to make the growth board, starting with removing the bark. Later, my son-in-law will turn this piece into a small table, which looks really nice. I used a draw knife to remove the bulk of the bark, and then as you'll see, I transitioned to a number of other tools. Here I'm using a wire brush and a drill. But after using this for a while, I decided I really didn't like how it was roughing up the wood. So I stopped doing that and went back to using the draw knife and chisels. I bought a set of flap sanders to use instead of the wire brush, but they didn't arrive in time. So I stuck with the draw knife and the chisel, being very careful to follow the live edge as closely as possible. After practicing on the test piece, I started working on the actual growth board. It was a lot of work and it created a lot of mess. I took my time with the chisel to get out all the pieces from all the little nooks and crannies, and again trying to follow the live edge as close as possible. Again, without the flap sander, I had to use a random orbit sander, but I took my time and it worked out pretty well. Here I'm hand sanding all the live edges with the used sandpaper from the random orbit sander. I just took my time and very carefully went through all the grits. Back on the test piece, I'm running it through the drum sander to smooth it all out. You could just as easily use a random orbit sander for this. Here I'm running the actual growth board through the drum sander. I did lots and lots of sanding with the random orbit sander up through 220. I won't show a whole lot of this, it's just really boring. Here I'm establishing a straight line for the number line, and then marking off the 1 foot and 6-inch marks. With the small trim router, I'm using a 1/2 inch straight bit to create the backbone of the number line. Here I'm just holding a block of wood with a 90-degree angle on it to help me guide the tick marks. After doing this, I realized I needed to create a proper jig to do this right. Here I've printed off some numbers in reverse and then used an iron set on its highest setting to transfer the number onto the walnut board. I then used a pencil to darken the outline and to draw in the center line of the numbers. My original plan was to carve the numbers out with chisels with a V-shaped cross-section, but after doing the first one, I decided it would be much easier to do it with a router. This is the first time I've done any epoxy inlay work, so I bought a kit from Total Boat that included the resin, the hardener, some mixing cups, and instructions. Since the quantity was so small, I just used a disposable plastic cup and some plastic utensils to mix things up. I used some violet colored pigment from Mayspring and some Pearl X white powder in the epoxy mix. I'll put links to those in the description so you can see what I used. Back at the growth board, I used a long level as a straight edge to help me guide the router when creating the backbone of the number line. Here you can see I made a jig out of 4 pieces of wood just glued together. The width of the space is equal to the outside diameter of a guide bushing. That way I can use different size router bits for the different size tick marks that I use along the number line. As it turns out, I made a mistake with the first tick mark. Since the number line starts at 2 inches, I shouldn't have put that one there, but you'll see later I fixed that with a brass plate. I glued in spacers to the jig to limit the length of the tick marks when I went to the 6-inch and 1-inch marks. I also used a 3/8 inch straight bit for the 6-inch tick marks and a 1/4 inch bit for the 1-inch tick marks. Here I'm just sanding the fuzz off of the tick marks created by the router and then fixing the inevitable chip outs with some CA glue. I found that using a chisel did a better job of cleaning up the edges. Once we settled on the font size for the numbers, I printed them all out in reverse and then ironed them onto the growth board the same way we did to the test piece. I asked my daughter not to go too crazy with the font for the name, and this is what she came up with, but I'm up for the challenge. When routing the numbers in the name, I started with a 3/16 carbide straight bit to hog out the big areas, and then switched to a 1/8 inch carbide bit for the smaller areas. I found that I could follow the curves much easier if I did a climb cut, in other words, moving the router in the same direction as it's spinning, as opposed to the opposite way. Here I'm just using some carving chisels to refine the edges, particularly along the curves. I was pretty happy with the routing results. I was even able to save the little slivers of wood in the loops on the K and the T. Here I'm brushing a coat of clear epoxy on all the routed areas. Not 100% sure why, but I've seen this on a lot of YouTube videos. In the end though, it produced a very sharp black line around the outside edges, which helped define the numbers and the borders. And here we are with the final pour. In the end it turned out pretty well, but if I had to do it over again, I probably would not have used that pearl powder for such a narrow pour. I probably would have just used a white powder to lighten the violet against the dark walnut. I found that using a spoke shave was the quickest way to remove the bulk of the epoxy sitting on top of the board. I then switched to a cabinet scraper to smooth things out. Here I'm just using some clear epoxy to fill in any pinholes that resulted from the pour. I started sanding with 80 grit to remove the marks from the drum sander, and then worked my way through 180. Here I'm spraying the board with water to raise the grain. I'll then sand it with 220. Here I'm putting the first coat of Osmo PolyX finish. After the first coat, it really didn't look all that great, but once I had the second and third coats on, it started to look really nice. I sanded with 320 between each coat, except for the last one where I sanded with 400 grit paper. Since the growth board is intended to be attached on the wall, I'm adding a spacer block to accommodate the baseboard molding. Here I'm adding a keyhole slot to the spacer block. Here I'm attaching the spacer block to the board at a specific height so they'll know where to drill the hole in the wall. Here I'm attaching a brass nameplate to cover up that mistake I made early on. Well, if you liked the video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. That'll help the channel in the future. That's all for now. Hopefully we'll see you the next time.